The knock at my door that morning felt heavier than usual, like trouble was waiting on the other side. And when I opened it to see a stern city code enforcement officer holding a clipboard with my address scribbled across the top, my pulse jumped, because I instantly knew the HOA had finally followed through on their threats. And sure enough, he introduced himself briskly and explained there had been multiple complaints about an illegal workshop operating on my property. His words clipped and authoritative, the kind that make most people shrink with worry. But instead of panicking, I held his gaze because I knew something he didn't. And the irony was almost too much to contain, because the workshop in question wasn't some shady, unsafe project. It was my personal garage, where I tinkered with prototypes and designs. Nothing more than the hobby of an engineer who spent his weekdays writing and reviewing city building codes for a living, codes that this very officer was citing. And as he rattled off supposed violations about ventilation, electrical load, and safety clearances, his tone smug as though he'd cornered me. I listened quietly, nodding, while a small group of neighbors peeked from across the street, whispering like they were watching a scandal unfold. The HOA board president standing proudly with arms crossed, smirking as if he'd finally put me in my place, because for months he had complained about the sound of my tools, the shipments of materials, and the simple fact that I had a workshop at all, calling it an eyesore. And he clearly thought code enforcement was his trump card. But I wasn't about to let a man drunk on HOA power dictate my passion or my rights. So when the officer finished his lecture and said, "You'll need to shut this down immediately or face citations and fines," I asked politely if I could show him something inside. And as we walked into my workshop, the scent of machine oil and cedar filling the air, I gestured toward the carefully arranged benches, the neatly wired outlets with their permits framed. On the wall, the fire extinguisher mounted exactly at regulation height, and the ventilation system humming quietly above, every detail meticulously aligned with city code, because I had designed it all myself down to the letter. And when he began pointing at things, claiming potential hazards, I calmly opened a drawer, pulled out a binder thicker than his clipboard, and flipped to the exact section of the municipal code that proved my setup was not only compliant, but exemplary, citing paragraphs and subclauses with the kind of precision only someone who wrote the code could manage. And the officer's face began to falter, his brows knitting together as he realized he was dealing with someone who knew these rules far better than he did. But I didn't stop there, because the HOA president had now marched up behind us, demanding the officer issue a fine immediately, shouting about neighborhood standards. So I turned to him with a measured smile and said, "Funny thing about standards, I wrote them." And I pulled out my city-issued badge that identified me not just as an engineer, but as the lead author of the very codebook being cited. And the silence that followed was delicious, the officer's jaw tightening as he recognized my authority, the HOA president's smirk shattering into confusion, neighbors gasping as the balance of power flipped instantly. And in that moment, I explained calmly that filing false complaints and harassing residents through weaponized enforcement wasn't just unethical, it bordered on illegal. And I looked the officer dead in the eye as I added, "You're standing in a workshop that was built to stricter standards than 90% of this city's construction projects." Because I designed the code myself, and the weight of those words sank in like a stone through water, the officer lowering his clipboard, suddenly deferential, admitting softly that everything appeared, and not no violations could, be issued. And as he backed away, apologizing for the inconvenience, the HOA president sputtered with anger, demanding to know how this could be allowed, his voice rising shrill, until I cut him off with one final blow, telling him in front of everyone that continued harassment would result in me filing an official report, not just with the HOA Oversight Committee, but with the city itself, since abuse of enforcement resources was a matter I had the authority to escalate. And the way he deflated shoulders sinking, lips pressed tight, was the sweetest justice I'd ever seen, because for months he had tried to paint me as reckless and non-compliant, when in reality, I had built the safest, most code-perfect workshop in the neighborhood, and now he had been exposed in front of the very people he tried to impress. And later that week, as word spread, neighbors who once avoided me now stopped by, curious about the machines, admiring the precision, even asking for advice on their own home projects. While the HOA grew suddenly quiet, their threats silenced, their petty rules softened, because they knew they had picked the wrong target. And as I stood in my workshop one evening, the glow of warm light bouncing off polished tools, the hum of a machine purring perfectly in compliance, I couldn't help but smile at the irony that the HOA had called code enforcement on me, thinking they could trap me with the very laws they didn't understand. But all they had done was give me the perfect chance to show everyone who I really was: the engineer who wrote the code, and the man who turned their weapon into his shield, proving once and for all that knowledge, when wielded calmly, is the greatest authority of all.